This is a review of Claude Mboli's Origin of African Languages. There's a new book on Proto-Black African Egyptian languages. Black African or Egyptian Negro-African is a name Afrocentric linguists have given to the genetic linguistic relationship between languages spoken by Black Africans and the ancient Egyptian language. This new book is called Origine des langues africaines, essai d'application de la méthode by Claude Mboli. Diasporinte génétique de la Egyptienne pharaonique et des langues négro-africaines is the most exhaustive study of Negro-Egyptian. And no matter what you say, it does prove Niger-Congo exists because it demonstrates connections between Egyptian and Niger-Congo languages. Mboli has divided Black African Egyptian language into 4 stages. Stage 1, the evolution grammatical du Negro-Egyptian, the grammaire du Negro-Egyptian archaique, grammar du Negro-Egyptian pre-classique, grammar du Negro-Egyptian classique, and grammar du Negro-Egyptian post-classique. You cannot detect the various forms of Egyptian claimed by Mboli without written text dating back to the proposed stages of a language. As a result, even though Mboli has divided the Egyptian languages into these 5 or 4 periods, he really doesn't have any textual evidence to back up his proposed stages. Before you can do any type of comparative linguistics, we have to have texts. It's these texts that allow us to make an inquiry into the historical relationship between languages. We only have contemporary linguistic evidence for the Black African languages to compare to the ancient Egyptian languages. One of the reasons why you look for textual evidence is due to the idea of F. de Saussure, who in Cours de Linguistique Générale, Paris 1916, discussed the idea of synchronic and diachronic linguistics. In relation to historical linguistics, diachronic linguistics looked at the state of a language in the past, while synchronic linguistics look at a language as it exists today. To determine a diachronic view of a language, you have to have written text. As a result, we only have written evidence of Egyptian in 2 stages, Old and Middle Egyptian. The phases imagined for Negro-Egyptian does not agree with the laws of linguistic continuity for African languages. Very important to understand. The rate at which languages change is variable. It appears that linguistic change is culture-specific. Consequently, the social organization and political culture of a particular language community can influence the speed at which languages change. Based on the history of language change in Europe, most linguists believe that the rate of change for all languages is both rapid and constant. The idea that all languages change rapidly is not valid for all the world's languages. Mboli has accepted this reality of Indo-European languages as existed in African languages too. Thus, he has created a series of stages for Negro-Egyptian based upon his ideas about the Indo-European languages, not Negro-Egyptian. African languages change much slower than European languages. As a result, you cannot use a European model of language change to describe events in Africa. For example, African vocabulary items collected by Arab explorers over 1,000 years ago are analogous to contemporary lexical items. Mboli does not recognize Coptic as an aspect of Egyptian, even though there are striking resemblances between the ancient Egyptian language and Coptic, and pharaonic Egyptian and African languages, which indicates continuity between and among the speakers of Negro-Egyptian. The political stability of African political institutions has caused languages to change only slowly in Africa. Polly and Ross argue that a sedentary lifestyle may account for the conservative nature of a language. African oral tradition and the eyewitness accounts of travelers in Africa make it clear that African empires, although made up of diverse nationalities, illustrated continuity. To accommodate the plural nature of African empires, Africans developed a federal system of government. In fact, we can not only really describe ancient African state systems as empires, since this implies absolute rule or authority in a single individual. This political state of affairs rarely existed in ancient Africa, because in each African speech community, local leadership was elected by the people within the community. For example, the Egyptians often appointed administrators over the conquered territories from among the conquered people. The continuity of many African languages may result from the steady-state nature of African political systems and long-standing cultural stability since Neolithic times. This cultural stability has affected the spread at which African languages change. In Africa, due to the relative stability of socio-political structures and settled life, there has not been enough pressure exerted on African societies as a whole, and African speech communities in particular, to cause radical internal linguistic change within most African languages. Permanent settlements led to a clearly defined system of inheritance and royal succession. These traits led to the stability on both the social and political levels. This leads to the hypothesis that linguistic continuity exists in Africa due to the stability of African socio-political structures and cultural systems. This relative cultural stability has led African languages to change more slowly than European and Asian languages. Diop observed that, and I quote, "First, the evolution of languages, instead of moving everywhere at the same rate of speed, seems like to other factors, such as the stability of social organization, or the opposite, social upheavals. Understandably, in relatively stable societies, man's language has changed less with the passage of time." This idea of Diop has formed what I call the continuity thesis, or linguistic continuity. This means, in a sense, that instead of looking at languages in Africa changing rapidly as they did in Europe, these languages change much slowly because of the stable political systems that African nations had. You cannot detect the various forms of Egyptian claimed by Mboli without written text. It's due to the ideas of Saussure, as I discussed earlier. Scholars group the Egyptian languages into 6 major chronological divisions. The archaic Egyptian language before 2600 BC, or the language of the early dynastic period. Old Egyptian language, 2686 BC to 2181 BC, the language of the Old Kingdom. Middle Egyptian language, characterizing Middle Egyptian as the period between 2055 BC to 1650 BC, but enduring through the early 18th dynasty until the Amarna period, 1353 BC, and continuing on as a literary language into the 4th century AD. The next period is Late Egyptian, 69 BC to 700 BC, and this Egyptian is characterized by the Third Intermediate period, but starting earlier with the Amarna period. The next stage is Demonic, the 7th century BC to the 5th century AD, Coptic, the 1st century AD to 17th century BC. Although most Egyptian linguists have divided the Egyptian language into these 7 periods, Mboli's view, as stated earlier, is basically archaic Egyptian, pre-classic Egyptian, classic Egyptian, and what he calls post-classic Egyptian. This is untenable because we don't have written records of Black African language extending this far back in time relating to the periods proposed by Mboli. So there's no way to compare the grammars of Black African languages and Egyptian. Moreover, if Mboli is of the opinion that Coptic is not an Egyptian language, even though it is a language used to read ancient Egyptian, we don't even have a model for post-classic Egyptian. You see, to decipher Egyptian, we needed Coptic, because Coptic was the modern form of Egyptian, and we could use this language to read the ancient text. We do have a diachronic view of Egyptian, but our data on African languages is all contemporary. We may recognize changes in the structure of Egyptian, for example, maybe a vowel to a consonant for words versus a consonant to a vowel for word. But overall, the grammars for Egyptian do not show radical changes. There's no way Mboli can claim he has reconstructed the various grammatical stages of Negro-Egyptian because we don't have written text with various proposed stages of the language that he classifies as Negro-Egyptian. Mboli cannot claim to present the stage of Negro-Egyptian because he fails to have a diachronic view of Negro-Egyptian due to a lack of written text and the language making up the subgroups of Negro-Egyptian. To be able to discover the various grammatical stages, styles discussed by Mboli, we need to see successive synchronic grammars of African languages as represented in written text. The true historical linguist looks at changes that have occurred in language through the comparison of successive diachronic grammars as indicated by text written in the various languages. You have to have written text. The absence of ancient text in the sub-languages of Negro-Egyptian proposed by Mboli, except for Egyptian and Mandi, makes any discussion of archaic Negro-Egyptian, post-classic Negro-Egyptian, etc. a moot point. In summary, Mboli has to support his claims for various periods of Egyptian and Black African languages with written and textual evidence, which would be evidence of grammars of the language at the particular time in history that he proposes that these stages in the Egyptian language existed. Textual evidence for Egyptian Black African languages for the periods in Black African Egyptian languages proposed by Mboli, as stated earlier, just do not exist. Because they fail to exist, he cannot propose this grand scheme for our ancient Egyptian. Mboli wants the Proto-Negro-Egyptian to agree with Proto-Indo-European terms. This is crazy, because the Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Negro-Egyptian are two different language families that were created by two different populations. As a result, in Mboli's reconstruction of proto-terms, he usually adds a H or W to his reconstructions, because if you look at Indo-European languages, they have an H or a W. You know. The reconstruction of Mboli's for cattle, lamb, ram, and horse are good examples of how he makes up these crazy reconstructions of Egyptian languages. Much of the evidence relating to the pastoral way of life comes from the discovery of cattle bones at excavated sites in the Sahara dating between 700 to 2000 BC, and the rock drawings of cattle. In the West Sahara, sites such as Erg and Sakani region and the Tawudeni basin of northern Mali attest to cattle husbandry between 6,000 and 5,000 BP. The Ovidic period, sheep, rams, goats, stuff like that, husbandry, on the other hand, in this area, dates between 5,000 to 3,000 years before the present. Cattle pastoral people began to settle Dar-Dashit and Karkanat between 500 to 3,500 BC. The term for cattle in various African languages are as follows. For example, in Egyptian we have and Nag. Wolof we have Nag. Fulani we have Nag. Angus we have Ning. Nkwe we have Ning. Susa, Ninge. Nur, Yang. Begwemini, Omyang, Omang. Kagoro, Nyak. Kaji, Nyak. Azir, Na. Saninki, Na. Sanufu, Nu. Amo, Na. Hausa, Nagi. Dravidian languages, Naku. Tulu, Naku. The correspondence between African terms for cattle support the archaeological evidence for the early domestication of cattle in the Proto-Sahara by African and Dravidian speakers. This view is supported by the similarity in the terms for cow, cattle, and by speakers of Mandi, Niger, Congo, Chadic, and Afro-Asiatic supersets of languages. The oldest written evidence for African terms for cattle comes from the Egyptian language. The Egyptian term for cattle, cow, as I said earlier, was yang or nag. In other African languages, we find either consonant n before the consonant g or k, e.g. n and a vowel, and that the final consonant is either g or k, or the nasal consonant ng before the vowel e, and a. For example, in plus I, a, nia, or nia. The evidence of cognition of African terms for cattle shows a considerable correspondence in the consonants and vowels within roots. For example, there's correspondence within the roots. In Niger-Congo, Nilotic, Mandi, Chadic, etc., we have G, K, G, K, K, G. In other words, we usually see in either one of these languages, either G or K. This shows correspondence. In other cases, we have S or Z. This shows correspondence. And then overall, we have just about all of these languages start with an N. The correspondence within vowels in Niger-Congo, Nilotic, Mandi, Chadic, Egyptian is E, Yi, E, U, A, U, E, U. The linguistic evidence supports the view that Proto-African term for cattle cow was yin or ink or nia. This data shows clearly that G and K were interchangeable consonants long before the separation of speakers of Negro-Egyptian into distinct African cultural linguistic groups. This view of the linguistic evidence for cattle in African languages are totally different from the way Mboli tries to predict proto term for cattle. To Mboli, we have hum for Egyptian and ingwe cattle for Bantu and Gomi. These words come from Mboli, page 592. The linguistic evidence for term for cattle makes it clear that the Proto-Egyptian term would not be aspirated as proposed by Mboli. So you would not find an H, you would not find for cattle. They had nyang. Not find ningwe, wininkwe for cattle. Bantu is Ngome. In other words, it appears that Mboli constructed this term with aspiration to make it analogous to Proto-Indo-European terms for cattle. It appears to me that Mboli's reconstruction of Proto-Negro-Egyptian terms was made to agree with Proto-Indo-European, and therefore do not reflect reliable reconstructions of Proto-Negro-Egyptian. The actual Paleo-African term for cow is yin yin, yang aka. You know. Mboli spends much of his time trying to make Proto-African Negro-Egyptian terms agree with Proto-Indo-European construction for the same word. A good example is the alleged proto-term for cattle cow, Ingwenei, which he says corresponds to the Bantu word Nguni, cattle, for which the Amazulu and Kin are named, the Nguni tribes. In historical linguistics and the reconstruction of proto-term, we apply the rule of Occam's razor, the preference for simplicity in the scientific method of constructing proto-languages. If we apply Occam's razor to Mboli's reconstruction of proto-term Ingwenei, cattle, we find that it does not truly reflect the probable Bantu origin for cattle or cow. Below is the terms for cow or cattle in some of the Bantu languages. For example, in Bimba, we have Ingombe. Bobangi, we have Ingombo. In Kikuyu, we have Ngombe. In Swahili, we have Nyangombe. In Bukusu, we have Shafu. In Hausa, in Kosa, we have Inombe. In Shona, we have Mombe. In Ibon, the Bantu word for cow, cattle, notice that they are CVC. In other words, consonant, vowel, consonant, maybe a consonant and a vowel in structure. The initial nasal consonant is followed by a vowel consonant, and the vowel again, CVC. Thus we have Inombe, Noma, and Ombo. In the Bantu languages, we often find an initial consonant in. This syllabic nasal consonant in Bantu language is usually attached to human and animate classes. This means that the actual root word for cow, cattle, in Bantu languages is umba. Even though Mboli recognizes that is a nasal affix in this reconstruction of kine, this word has nothing to do with either Nguni and definitely not Ngombe. Instead of Ngombe, he has Nginye. None of this is supported by the actual linguistic text. And Mboli should not care about making the reconstruction of Proto-Negro-Egyptian conform to Proto-Indo-European. They should be made pursuant to African sound laws. And Mboli does not present an accurate description of Negro-Egyptian. The aim of his work is to make Negro-Egyptian agree with Proto-Indo-European vocabulary items. Therefore, it tells us nothing about the Proto-Egyptian language. Thus, the Mboli's work has no real agreement with what we would call ancient Negro-Egyptian languages. It is just a made-up lie. It is a falsehood meant to please Europeans instead of telling people the truth.